Thank you all for being here. My name is Larry Rosenthal. I am the chair of the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies. And let me immediately ask people, please turn off your phones, which can create great embarrassment. The way this is going to run is that our speaker, George Hawley, will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions and answers. I would like to let people know what our next event is going to be. It will be on Tuesday, April 10th, 4 p.m. in this room, and Dr. Maurice Cotier, a visiting fellow in the history department at Harvard University, will speak on popular neoliberalism, readers' and viewers' reactions to Milton Friedman. And I suggest you all plan to join us. Today's speaker is George Hawley. George is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Alabama. George's research interests include demography, electoral behavior, political parties, immigration policy, and the conservative movement in America. His PhD is from the University of Houston, and his undergraduate degree in political science and print journalism is from Central Washington University. His first book was Right-Wing Critics of American Conservatism, which was published by the University Press of Kansas in 2016. And his most recent book is this, which is called Making Sense of the AltRight, which came out in 2017, and one must certainly applaud his timeliness. Today, Professor Hawley is going to talk to us on the topic of, is the alt-right collapsing? So please join me in welcoming George Hawley.
I want to thank everyone for this generous invitation. I'm very happy to join you this evening. As noted, our topic for tonight is the alt-right collapsing? And I think the answer to that question is a qualified yes. The alt-right is probably not going to disappear, but it is becoming weaker and more divided. And with each setback, it becomes more fractious. The tremendous growth that it experienced in 2015 and 2016 has stopped. And many people seem to be backing away from the movement who had once shown great enthusiasm for it. And this may very well be the last talk that I give on this subject. Over the last year and a half or so, I've been invited to discuss this subject and similar topics at various venues across the country. It's perhaps telling that after today, I have no more talks on this subject on my calendar. People are justifiably becoming less interested in hearing about the alt-right, which serves me fine, or suits me fine, as I would like to turn my attention to other topics. I should say just a few words about how I came to end up writing about this particular issue, because to some extent it did happen by accident. My third book, Right-Wing Critics of American Conservatism, which I wrote in 2014, provided an overview of those right-wing intellectual currents that were never fully incorporated into the mainstream conservative movement. That project discussed localists, libertarians, paleo-conservatives, secular conservatism, European right-wing movements, and had a small chapter on white nationalists. And the book's thesis was that the conservative movement that we've known since the 1950s is actually much weaker than it appeared, and that its grip on the Republican Party was not as strong as they thought. I argued that at some point in the future, a right-wing alternative to mainstream conservatism would arrive, and it would be wise to consider what that alternative might be. Now, at the time, I didn't make any predictions about a timeline for when that would happen, So after I submitted that book for peer review, I moved on to other subjects. I wrote a book on religious decline in the United States and thought that that would dominate my research agenda for quite some time. Then, of course, Donald Trump took his ride down the golden escalator and launched his campaign setting the conservative movement and American politics more generally into chaos. And as that campaign dragged on, it became clear that Trump was going to be more than just a sideshow. I returned to this question of the American right's future, and I started writing a new book on sort of the meaning of Trump, and that book covered lots of different topics, middle American radicalism, public opinion and how it relates to conservative policies, the conservative movement's intellectual deterioration, right-wing populism, and the decline of the religious right. And that book had just one chapter on the alt-right, and in that chapter I suggested that the alt-right was not particularly important. Well, I thought that draft was pretty good, so I submitted it for review at Columbia University Press, but one of the two reviewers very strenuously disagreed with my assessment of whether that project was any good. So that hamstrung it, and I thought that, well, I would go back, fix that, and submit it elsewhere. But to my luck, the editor at Columbia had apparently better instincts than I did and said, well, actually, I think inside that chapter on the alt-right is the nucleus for a standalone book, and you should focus on that. So that's how this project came to be. And so the end result was my fifth book, Making Sense of the Alt-Right. And so, to some extent, my status as a scholar of this subject developed a bit by chance. Now, when I started writing about this topic, I had to spend a lot of time explaining what the alt-right is and what it believes. I don't really think that's necessary anymore. The alt-right, short for alternative right, was once a confusing movement. It wasn't always clear what it really wanted. And I argued that white nationalism has always been at the core of the alt-right, even if there was a period when some people, perhaps a majority of people that identified as alt-right, didn't consider themselves white nationalists. Now, I'm not interested in discussing the details of white nationalism as an ideology, so let me just say that I generally like Professor Damon Berry's definition of the term. According to Professor Berry, white nationalism is what he calls, quote, racial protectionism, predicated on the belief that, quote, the white race is imperiled and that it is the duty of every white man and woman to do what they must to protect it from biological extinction, end quote. So in the long term, American white nationalists want to create a racially pure white ethno-state, which of course would entail various degrees of ethnic cleansing and that sort of thing. And that's the goal of the main ideologues responsible for creating the alt-right. I thus consider the alt-right to be a much more radical movement than the right-wing populist movement that put Donald Trump into the presidency. Though President Trump's campaign was critical to the alt-right's growth. Now, although racism has existed since the concept of race was invented, white nationalism, as we currently understand it, is relatively new. Contemporary white nationalism seeks to cultivate a pan-European sense of white identity that transcends national, ethnic, and religious boundaries. And it really only developed as we now understand it after World War II. Some scholars have named a racist and anti-Semitic ideologue named Francis Parker Yockey as the father of white nationalism, and I agree with that assessment. Now, since that time in the 40s and 50s, when these ideas were first starting to form as we now recognize them, right-wing racial extremism has become really a permanent fixture of the American political landscape. In the 1960s, George Lincoln Rockwell was the leader of the American Nazi Party and was the face of American white nationalism until he was murdered by a fellow neo-Nazi in 1967. Following the breakdown of that group, other groups developed that continued pushing these ideas. William Pierce formed the National Alliance. Ben Clausen formed the World Church of the Creator. Richard Butler formed the Aryan Nations. Tom Metzger formed the White Aryan Resistance. Racist skinhead groups started popping up around the country in the late 1970s, and some of these ended up being incorporated into more formal organizations. Now, one thing to note about all of these groups just mentioned was that they were small, marginalized, and dysfunctional. Though they were responsible for many atrocious acts of violence. For example, in 1983 and 1984, a white supremacist terrorist group known as The Order conducted a series of robberies and assassinated a liberal talk radio host. A shootout with law enforcement eventually brought the group down. Members of other groups, of course, committed major hate crimes, including murders. So although deadly, the white nationalist movement of the late 20th century posed, in the aggregate, a small threat to the prevailing social order. Even at its peak, if all the various organizations were combined together, the movement could really claim no more than a few thousand adherents. And it might not even make sense to try to combine them all together, think of them as being a united movement, as a lot of these groups despised each other. These major white nationalist groups usually built around an individual charismatic leader, and they would often resemble something that looked more like a criminal gang or even a religious cult than a real political movement. So when one of these leaders would die or be imprisoned, his group usually fell apart quite quickly. And perhaps more importantly, most ordinary Americans, even those who might have a high level of racial anxiety and animus, didn't want anything to do with them. These groups attracted antisocial personalities prone to criminality and violence. Now, the alt-right, in terms of its core ideology, is similar to these older groups. However, it was potentially more consequential because it didn't look like it was going to follow that same trajectory. The alt-right began to describe its forebears derisively as white nationalism 1.0, and it argued that it, compared to its forebears, was something new and it was more effective in their minds. And in reality, for a while, it was more effective. Now, the alt-right as a term was useful because it was vague. It wasn't inherently racial or extreme, and without knowing any context, you wouldn't really know what it was about. All you would know is that it was somehow right of center and not really part of mainstream conservatism. And that's largely how the term was used right when it was first coined in 2008 by Richard Spencer, though not long after that, after Spencer created his website alternativeright.com in 2010, its racial angle became more apparent, and people not interested in explicit white identity politics mostly stopped using it. As an aside, people often fail to note that the term alt-right almost died a couple of years ago. After Spencer shut down his first alternative right website and personally stopped using the term, it kind of looked like it was going to fall out of favor even on the far right, though the term would make an aggressive comeback starting in around early 2015, maybe a little bit before. Its return was apparently spontaneous. That is, it wasn't part of any kind of deliberate plan to revive alt-right as a label, but it did just start appearing more frequently on social media and on various far-right message boards. So this new iteration of the alt-right, it was never very organized. It was a mob of mostly anonymous right-wing agitators, mostly just trolling online. Now, when we say troll, we simply mean a person that provokes discord on the internet. Now, trolling doesn't necessarily serve a greater purpose than the troll's personal amusement. It can take the form of deception, contrarianism, especially pointless contrarianism, or offensive language. Trolling isn't necessarily political, and when it is political, it's not necessarily right-wing. But the alt-right viewed trolling per se as very serious business. What the alt-right wanted to do was to disrupt the political and social status quo, which it viewed as a hindrance to its own growth as a movement. It wanted to push those boundaries of acceptable speech and take advantage of every opportunity to sow disagreement and distrust in American life. So to the alt-right, enraging a political opponent was considered a victory, even if the troll did not change the target's mind about anything. Now, public trolling on social media or in a message board will be viewed by lots of people. And these other people, these lurkers, not necessarily even part of the conversation, are usually the troll's intended audience. Now, followers of the movement, of the alt-right, to the extent that it was a movement, tended to congregate on particular websites and message boards and image boards. Places like 4chan were particularly significant. However, I would argue that Twitter was the most important platform for the alt-right. The alt-right has had a presence online since the internet first became available. However, for most of its history, it was cordoned off, mostly, from the broader discussion. There were radical right websites and message boards, places like Stormfront. But if you weren't deliberately looking for that kind of material, lots of people could kind of remain oblivious to its existence. Social media really changed this. Twitter was the alt-right's most effective means of circulating its ideas and images. Now again, most content on Twitter is not racist or even political, but the site is very useful for online propagandists, and this is true really for all sorts of online activist movements. Now I imagine most people in this room are familiar with the site, but if not, I should just note that Twitter is a social media platform where people have a limited number of characters to express a thought. So alt-right content started to appear on Twitter and also on various other social media sites. But Twitter had advantages that other social media sites didn't have. For example, Twitter allows the creation of anonymous accounts, unlike Facebook, which requires you to register with your name. You only need an email address to get on Twitter, and one person can have as many Twitter accounts as they have emails. Twitter also makes it very easy to engage with strangers in conversation. On Facebook, conversations usually happen between friends, but on Twitter you can tag people in tweets or comment on their tweets even if they don't follow you. So it is possible to block specific users from interacting with your account, but the ease with which a person can generate a new account makes this a minor inconvenience. So Twitter is also important because it has a massive number of public figures using the site, President Trump being the most prominent example, of course. Now, the site is also a valuable tool for politicians, for journalists and celebrities, anyone who wants to disseminate a message quickly to a large number of followers. But it's important to note that the site also allows anyone to respond to those messages. And then the person who made the original remark is going to see all of the responses that came back. Now, unlike comment sections at major news venues, there's no process for filtering out responses or mentions on Twitter, though again, you do have the option of blocking specific accounts. So it's really this was really the initial means by which the alt-right started to enter into public consciousness, started to get more mainstream attention from outside of its own insular radical right-wing world. At the start of 2015, the number of people that would have identified as alt-right was extraordinarily small, but as they started to build up their presence on these platforms and started to harass public figures relentlessly, responding to their tweets with racist and anti-Semitic invective, people started to notice and started to pay attention. So by engaging with these public figures, the alt-right was able to spread its message to a new audience that was previously inaccessible. Famous people often enjoy millions of followers on Twitter, so by replying to tweets by prominent people, they can ensure that a massive number of people view their message. And of course, a troll is especially delighted when a targeted person interacts with them, even if it's to denounce them, because such interactions demonstrate that the troll successfully provoked an emotional reaction. And then, of course, once a troll is successfully engaged with someone, other trolls from that person's network are likely to join the conversation, piling on in the hope that they can continue the discussion and gain additional attention. So as these attacks were continuing, stories about the alt-right and its supposedly growing army of internet Nazis started to show up at major news venues. And these stories would bring the movement additional attention. So as the alt-right was gaining a foothold in social media and successfully entering the public discussion, it then, of course, was handed an additional gift when Donald Trump entered the Republican primaries. Now, as I've argued elsewhere, I do not consider Trump himself to be part of the alt-right, but his arrival on the political scene did provide the alt-right an opportunity for the alt-right to make its case. Trump not only set a new tone for discussions about race and immigration, but he helped to demonstrate the weakness of the conservative movement, which for a long time had served as a bit of a gatekeeper of right-wing thought in America. Now, most of the leading figures in the alt-right recognized that at least at some level Trump was not really one of them, even if he was far to the right of a lot of other Republicans on the issues that they cared about. But he did create this mass movement that was in some ways ideologically proximate to the alt-right in a number of ways. And he also, for the first time in a long time, gave white nationalists a presidential candidate to root for. And this is the first time this had happened in decades. The radical right had previously been mostly indifferent to partisan politics. The extreme right didn't get particularly enthused about, say, Bob Dole or George W. Bush or John McCain or Mitt Romney. So for the first time in many years, white nationalists found themselves as part of a larger coalition. And they were interacting with people outside of their own movement in a meaningful way and working with them toward the same goal. Now, part of the alt-right's success also came out of its tone. Its sensibilities grew out of the, as mentioned, internet troll culture. And within that culture, it's often difficult to know if somebody is being serious or just saying shocking and outrageous things in order to provoke outrage and then to simply enjoy a brief moment of nihilistic amusement. And to a lot of observers, the alt-right looked like kind of a band of right-wing pranksters or right-wing court jesters who were sort of being transgressive for its own sake, but it wasn't always clear the degree to which any of them were serious about a particular ideology. But by being transgressive and shocking, and by agitating both progressives and sort of stodgy mainstream conservatives, the alt-right was able to present itself to the world as, to some degree, being kind of a fun movement, something that allowed somebody to feel politically incorrect and transgressive, and a way to react against what it was called political correctness. Now, to some extent, mainstream conservatives share the blame for creating an atmosphere in which the alt-right could thrive. We need to remember that for years, conservatives have been railing against so-called political correctness and saying, well, anybody who can't take a joke is a quote-unquote snowflake. There's this idea, this meme in conservative media that liberals are a bunch of humorless scolds, and this has become so ingrained among conservatives that a lot of them weren't really taking complaints about the alt-right seriously. And perhaps they even enjoyed the degree to which it was provoking this furious reaction from major figures on the left. Now, as 2015 and 2016 dragged on, this term alt-right became increasingly popular to the point that it started to become associated with people that weren't necessarily interested in racial nationalism. By the summer of 2016, it was almost a catch-all term for the entire Trump phenomenon. Now, within the alt-right itself, the sort of the core ideologues of the alt-right, there was a serious discussion as to what this growing popularity meant. There were some in the alt-right that were concerned that these more moderate people were a problem. That is, that they were co-opting the term and watering down its message. In hindsight, it's clear that the alt-right enjoyed its greatest success when it was kind of a nebulous blanket term that included various different ideological tendencies. The alt-right for a while was this big space that white nationalists could enter into and interact with others outside of its own insular world. For this brief period, the racist right online was not cordoned off from the rest of the political ecosphere. So it was around this time that the alt-right coined a new term for some of its fellow travelers, what they started to call the AltLight, which, despite being coined by the alt-right, I actually think is a generally appropriate term. Now, the alt-light were people who shared the alt-right's trollish sensibilities. They would spread similar memes online. They supported Trump, and they attacked progressives, as well as attacked conservatives who were against Trump. However, a difference was that the alt-right usually was careful to stop short of calling for explicit white identity politics. In fact, their common trope was that they were against all forms of identity politics, usually preferring to call themselves things like cultural libertarians. They would insist that they were civic nationalists rather than ethno-nationalists. They would all declare that they were not anti-Semitic and that they loved Israel, two things that definitely set it apart from the rest of the alt-right. This group included people like Milo Yiannopoulos, Gavin McInnes, Paul Joseph Watson, and Jack Posobiec. Now, I should note that these alt-light figures online had much bigger followings than any of the main ideologues in the alt-right. Now, one can reasonably debate how large the gap between the alt-right and the alt-light really was. one can argue that the alt-light's moderation was more apparent than real, and that the alt-light was just pretending to reject the alt-right's more radical agenda. Some of the leaked emails from Milo Yiannopoulos that show that he had been working with open white nationalists when he was writing a very misleading article about the alt-right suggests that might have been the case. But for the most part, I, for myself, am mostly willing to take the alt-lights at their word when they say that they reject core elements of the alt-right's ideology. Now, regardless of how real this distinction was, the alt-right and the alt-light had a mostly congenial relationship throughout the election season. They didn't regularly denounce each other, and they focused their attention on promoting Trump and attacking Trump's enemies. So for a time, the alt-right was a very large tent, including a large number of people. But the situation didn't long survive the election. Almost immediately after Trump's victory, this broad movement began to fracture. A key moment in this came after Richard Spencer hosted a National Policy Institute conference in Washington, D.C. That was to celebrate Trump's win. Spencer ended his speech, which ended the conference, by declaring, quote, "Hail Trump," and a large number of people in the audience responded with Nazi salutes. Now, this was controversial even within the alt-right, even people who shared his ideology, who argued that this was, quote, bad optics. The event came to be known as Heilgate. So this event, for the first time ever, caused Donald Trump to finally actually denounce the alt-right. And the alt-right similarly broke rank from the rest of the alt-right and began trying to distance itself from the open white nationalists. When Mike Cernovich, through his party that he called the Deplorable a month later, that was supposed to celebrate Trump's win, he made it clear that white nationalists were not invited and not welcome. So the alt-right's decision at that time to break away from the more extreme alt-right made sense. After Trump's victory, I think a lot of these people thought that they were about to enter into the mainstream, that there was a new sort of tone in Washington and the media landscape. And I think that a lot of them actually thought they were going to, in some sense, displace and replace traditional media. Whether or not that could have happened, I don't know. But even after breaking with the alt-light basically imploded on its own. Milo Yiannopoulos' career seemed to be on the upswing after the election. He forcefully declared that he rejected white nationalism and white identity politics. He was offered a book deal with a massive advance. He was offered a speaking slot at CPAC, which is the most important annual gathering of conservatives. All of that came crashing down when people discovered a video of Yiannopoulos in which he appeared to be praising pederasty. So both his CPAC speech and his book deal were canceled, and he even lost his job at Breitbart. So Yiannopoulos is now a pretty marginal figure in the political media landscape. Figures like Cernovich and Watson also looked like they had a shot at becoming sort of more serious journalists, of being taken more seriously by a larger swath of people. But they managed to tarnish their own brand by deciding to go all in on the so-called Pizzagate conspiracy theory. Now, the details of that theory aren't worth going into, but it was stupid and it was malicious and it came very close to causing real-world violence. So they demonstrated, I think, pretty clearly that they were not ready for the mainstream. The alt-right also suffered because it didn't really have a coherent message of its own. Its leaders said that they loved Trump, but they rejected white nationalism. But it wasn't always clear exactly what it is they wanted to do and where it is they wanted to take America. So they had a sort of a lack of clear ideological moorings, which led to some baffling inconsistencies. The alt-right, for example, describes itself as a movement of free speech purists. Yet alt-light personalities like Jack Posobiec and Laura Loomer had no problem storming the stage during a showing of William Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, because the actor who played Trump was dressed up like, or who played Caesar dressed up like Trump. These two alt-light personalities declared, well, that this represents, quote, the normalization of political violence against the right, end quote, and so that for that reason they needed to shut it down. Well, so much for free speech and accepting all forms of communication. So the alt-light does still exist, though most of them don't use that term. They prefer to call themselves New Right, which hasn't really caught on. I think in part because so many different groups have called themselves New Right that they've not really been able to claim it for themselves. Not many of them call themselves AltLight. I think Gavin McInnes is the only significant exception to that. But in any event, that group's influence now also looks pretty minor. So, returning to the subject of the alt-right's white nationalist core, after Trump's win, the alt-right really did feel like it had the wind at its back and that it was time for it to stop being a purely online phenomenon. It wanted to show that it was a real political movement and ready to become a normal part of American politics. So the major names concluded, probably correctly, that they had hit a ceiling on what they could accomplish as a movement of anonymous trolls, of bloggers, and of podcasters. So to achieve greater influence, they decided that the alt-right had to start showing its face in the real world. But the question was, how would this happen? The alt-right didn't have the funds to create some kind of alt-right think tank, nor is it clear who would have worked as alt-right policy analysts or lobbyists, even if they had the money to do so. There was some chatter online about people in the alt-right finding positions in the White House. Now, although it's true that people like Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller were far to the right of most Republicans on questions of immigration and those sorts of things, it appears from the outside that the White House is mostly staffed with conventional Republicans. So, with few options available to them, in 2017, the alt-right decided that it was going to focus its attention on public rallies. Now, most of these were small. The alt-right, at these small rallies, did try to maintain a certain degree of aesthetic standards. The attendees at these rallies tried not to look like earlier generations of white nationalists, preferring polo shirts and khakis to swastika armbands. Richard Spencer also continued giving talks on college campuses. Now, as the year progressed and the alt-right became bolder, it decided it was time for it to host its first big rally. And it would announce it months in advance and try to make it as large as possible. And the end result was the Unite the Right rally of August of 2017, which was intended to be a watershed moment for the alt-right. Now, the supposed catalyst for this event was the city of Charlottesville's decision to take down a statue of Robert E. Lee. I should note that prior to this, the alt-right had not really shown very much interest in questions of Confederate heritage. So I would argue that that particular choice was simply an opportunity they had, as opposed to any real interest in, say, Civil War history. But in any event, they managed to cobble together most of the big names of the alt-right movement who were scheduled to speak at this event, and it did look like many hundreds of people were going to attend. But the event did not turn out as the organizers had planned. Now, Unite the Right was the largest gathering of white nationalists since at least 2002. However, on August 12th, they were vastly outnumbered by counter-protesters. Now, they expected opposition, but this event didn't follow the usual playbooks for rallies of this kind. Now, these types of extreme right events usually follow a particular pattern, especially when the events are announced ahead of time and the organizers go about getting permits from the local governments. What usually happens is the far-right protesters follow a designated path to the rally, and counter-protesters have their own designated space, and the two sides will hurl epithets at each other while the police keep them mostly separated from each other as they stand across various barricades. This event was different. As I wasn't there, it's hard for me to discern exactly what happened, and some stories are conflicting, but most stories indicate that the local authorities made comparatively little effort to keep the various sides separated from each other. Fights between the two sides broke out well before the official speeches were scheduled to begin. And because of these clashes, the governor of Virginia declared a state of emergency, the Virginia police declared the event was an unlawful assembly, and riot police cleared the alt-right attendees from the park, which then set off another wave of violence as those people leaving the park had to go through a throng of counter-protesters to get out of the city. And then, of course, the rally turned deadly 2 hours after the event was initially dispersed. A young man named James Fields, who was there as part of the alt-right event, allegedly drove his car into a crowd of anti-racist protesters, killing one of them, a woman named Heather Heyer. He also allegedly injured 19 others as a result. The incident was captured on video, and Fields was subsequently arrested and charged with second-degree murder, malicious wounding, and failure to stop following an accident. A couple of months later, the charge was upgraded to first-degree murder. So, Unite the Right did accomplish one of its goals. It did make headlines across the globe. But the event also permanently tarnished the alt-right brand. Following the rally, in which alt-right supporters marched openly, making no effort to hide their faces, the movement experienced a new round of doxings. That is, it had its information exposed to the public. People were named. Now, doxings had been a problem within the alt-right for a long time, but usually doxings were targeted at significant content creators or people who you might consider leaders of some sort within the movement. This time was different in that just ordinary attendees were doxed, and people who had jobs that were totally apolitical ended up losing those jobs. For example, right here in California, somebody who worked at a hot dog restaurant was fired for having attended this event. A number of
right here, next door to us.
A number of undergraduate students were identified, and as a result, their universities felt compelled to release statements condemning racism. So if Unite the Right was intended to demonstrate that the alt-right had become a normal part of American politics, and people in the movement could now start being open with their views, well, then it was an obvious failure. Now, it's difficult to measure this quantitatively, but it does also seem that Unite the Right changed the public's perception of the alt-right movement. Now, remember, the alt-right had previously tried to distance itself from what it called white nationalism 1.0. Although its main ideologues shared the hope to create one day a racially pure ethno-state, they tried to create a brand that was qualitatively different from the KKK or the National Alliance or the Aryan nations. And they had some success with that. Before Unite the Right, some observers were still viewing the alt-right as, a band of irreverent, online, politically correct pranksters. But after Unite the Right, that perception was gone. It was gone permanently. And although the fatal car crash was one key event that changed the public view of the alt-right, I think it's important to note that even if that hadn't happened, the movement had a bigger problem. It really had no way to transition off of the internet and into the real world without losing some of those elements that had made it appealing to some people. Things like trolling and frog memes and internet irony can't really be translated into real-world events. They can't be replicated offline. And away from computer screens, the alt-right was no longer able to present itself as kind of a fun counterculture. Another problem that the alt-right faced in terms of what they call optics is that when organizing in the real world, they have to make the trade-off between size and image control. That is, when the alt-right plans small rallies with only highly vetted people involved, they're able to, at least partially, control the look and the behavior of the people that show up. But the end result, of course, is a rally that is very sparsely attended and can be mocked on those grounds. If they want to make a big rally and announce it ahead of time and try to get as many people as they can, well, what they end up with are people waving swastika flags. And so the images that came out of Charlottesville looked a lot like images that we would see from, say, 1990s white nationalist groups, which we've already stated were completely ineffective as political movements. So, having seen that Unite the Right totally changed the alt-right, it's important to note that the change became permanent, because even if everyone involved had decided, well, that was a mistake, okay, it's time for them to go back to the way things were, go back to the old methods, they couldn't just turn back the clock because the public's perception has permanently changed. Also, Unite the Right opened the alt-right up to legal challenges. Now, the extreme right has always had a problem of drawing people with a penchant for violence, and this has always caused various white nationalist organizations great difficulties, because lawsuits dealt most of the major white nationalist organizations devastating and sometimes killing blows in the 1990s and 2000s. When people associated with the World Church of the Creator attacked people, that organization would be successfully sued, wiping out its meager assets and making organization more difficult. Similarly, when the Aryan Nations was responsible for attacking people, they ended up being sued and lost their compound. So that the lawsuit threat really kept some of these older organizations from getting off the ground. And now many people in the alt-right are facing similar legal challenges. Now, I'm not a lawyer and I cannot even speculate the chances that these lawsuits, these posting AltRight lawsuits, have of success. But success isn't really that important. Because even if these lawsuits against people like Richard Spencer and some of the others don't succeed, they are an incredible nuisance and they hinder the movement's ability to focus on anything else. They're forcing a movement that was already operating on a shoestring budget to spend its time fighting lawsuits and its money on lawyers. The online alt-right also faces new challenges because Unite the Right set off a new wave of online no-platforming, creating new challenges for the movement on the internet and crippling its ability to raise money. And this had actually started before Unite the Right occurred. Throughout 2017, tech companies were increasingly trying to deny the alt-right access to their services. PayPal was one significant one. It deleted the accounts of AltRight.com, of the National Policy Institute, of American Renaissance, of Identity Europa, and various other groups and websites, which caused the movement a lot of headaches as the alt-right conducts most of its fundraising on the internet, and PayPal is the most popular payment service. Amazon similarly canceled its affiliate program with a lot of different alt-right websites. The Amazon affiliate program is one where if you visit Amazon through a link at one of these sites, that site gets some cut of any purchases made as part of that visit. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but a number of sites actually got a fair amount of income as a result of these affiliate programs. Reddit deleted the r/alt-right subreddit, which was one of the most popular alt-right forums. And of course, the most dramatic case of no platforming occurred when the major web hosting platforms tried to push the Daily Stormer off of the internet entirely. GoDaddy canceled the site's domain registration. Cloudflare canceled its DDoS protection. Google banned the site from its domain registration. So the site, this is Andrew Angelin's site, was having to jump from one domain to another trying to stay online, briefly finding hosts in countries like Russia, Albania, and Iceland. Now, and after every ban, it would become inaccessible through ordinary web browsers, and you could only see it if you had the web browser Tor. This is significant because for quite some time the Daily Stormer was the most visited alt-right website. Now, furthermore, although the Unite the Right event was supposed to demonstrate this new great unity of the far right, the end result was anything but that. With infighting broke out almost the moment the event was over. For weeks, people in the alt-right were engaged in vitriolic debates about optics and how the movement should organize itself in the future. And over the last 6 months, these discussions have actually gotten more heated rather than less. Watching it from the outside, it's clear that the alt-right is actually spending more time infighting than attacking outwards. And it's starting to splinter off into various camps that do not get along with each other. And in recent months, lots of people are disengaging with the alt-right entirely. Anecdotally, several of the people that I interviewed for my book have simply vanished from the internet, deleting their social media accounts and leaving me with no way to access them to even find out what exactly their thinking was. Now, whether they backed away because their minds had changed about political questions or they're afraid of being doxxed is really beside the point. What matters is that they're not contributing to the movement anymore. Now, the online trolling aspect of the alt-right is still there. They're still doing that kind of work on the internet. But absent the context of a presidential election, when there was a clear set of goals and an obvious set of enemies, the trolls are just kind of randomly attacking in any direction in a rather nihilistic manner, and it's not clear that it's having any significant political effect on anyone. And in fact, sometimes their efforts do the white nationalist movement harm. The most obvious example occurred just a few weeks ago. And now people in the alt-right, the trollish element of the alt-right likes to play pranks on journalists, to get journalists to sort of chase their own tail or get them to print false stories. Now, they do that because they think it's funny, but also it's part of a larger effort to try to discredit mainstream sources of information. Now, some elements of the online alt-right did this again after the recent school massacre in Florida. Specifically, some anonymous alt-right people started the rumor that the person who allegedly murdered 17 people in Parkland, Florida, was a member of a fringe white nationalist group. Now, this seems completely baffling that they would do this. Part of it was that it was kind of an inside joke. That is, the group that they named had a reputation for being especially ridiculous, and even other white nationalists routinely ridiculed it. So they thought, though, it would be funny if they could somehow attach this group to the Parkland shooting. However, the story that became the banner headline at Drudge Report was that the killer was a member of a white nationalist group. Now, when the prank was eventually revealed and the stories did get corrected, that wasn't the end of it, because how many people saw the initial headline but never saw the correction? So the alt-rights had simply handed its opponents a major propaganda victory for the sake of a rather juvenile joke. So it's safe to say that the alt-rights' reputation as being skillful internet propagandists has been overstated. Now, alt-right content creators are still able to occasionally create memes that go viral and capture the public's attention, but they seem to be having less and less success at this. Now, in the real world, of course, the alt-right is completely at a loss as to what to do next. Different alt-right groups have hosted some small rallies since Unite the Right, but they've been mostly insignificant. I consider it very unlikely that the alt-right will at any time soon host another rally that draws hundreds of people. Richard Spencer recently canceled any new editions on his college speaking tour after an event held at Michigan State University turned out to be a bust. Only a tiny number of people attended it, in part because of the aggressive counter-protesters outside. So that avenue for outreach also seems to be closed off. The formal, real-world existing alt-right organizations are also creating a firmer barrier between themselves and the alt-right. A group called the Proud Boys, which is Gavin McInnes's organization, has now cut off even any tangential ties to the alt-right. McInnes now says that any Proud Boy who takes part in alt-right activities will be booted from the group. Now, far-right groups like Identity Europa are still able to hold small flash mob-style events in which they rapidly assemble, they spread their message, and then disperse before the opposition can organize. And they also, are still posting stickers in, downtowns and in college campuses, but that's about it. All they can really do is demonstrate that, yes, in fact, they do still exist. But the fact of the matter is that in the real world, the alt-right is being out-organized and outmaneuvered at every turn. It is, whenever they try to hold something, they find themselves outnumbered. Now, there was, until a couple of days ago, one alt-right group that you could always count on to show up, regardless of the opposition. And this was a group called the Traditionalist Party, a fascist group led by a guy named Matt Heimbach. Now, it was never large, but it was always able to provide bodies for alt-right events. If there was an alt-right event, you could pretty much be sure that they would be there. Now, the group always declared that it had these big, ambitious plans for, ending the opioid epidemic in Appalachia, and running political candidates, that sort of thing. But from what I can tell, its main activities were mostly just trying to get the media's attention and brawling with anti-fascist counter-protesters. Well, Traditionalist Worker Party is gone now too. Because of a violent domestic dispute, which I won't go into here, but the details are quite lurid and embarrassing for all the people involved, looks like they are finished forever, and their leader is quite likely going to go to jail for a while. I should also note that Steve Bannon now looks like he's also out of the picture, though his movement is somewhat different from the alt-right. But I'm not convinced that Bannon will remain politically significant for much longer. Bannon had these great aspirations to create a new nationalist version of the Tea Party, to take over the GOP by challenging mainstream conservative Republicans in primary elections. That came to an end when Roy Moore lost what should have been an easy victory in the Alabama Senate race. And then he got faced another problem when another one of his prospects, Paul Nealon, imploded his own campaign when he decided that he was going to go all in and run as an open alt-right anti-Semite, and now suddenly Bannon doesn't have much of a pool of people that he can use for these primary challenges. And then, of course, because of recent revelations of what Bannon had said about Trump back in 2016, he's been cut off totally from the White House, and he's been fired from Breitbart. So that aspect of the far right seems to be disappearing as well. So all of these different factions that we could sort of lump together in sort of the bigger alt-right milieu are all facing enormous challenges, and we're seeing splintering at all levels. Now, perhaps the alt-right will develop some new strategy that's going to reunite these various factions and allow it to grow again. I have no idea what a strategy like that would look like, but I suppose it is possible. But for now, the important thing to note is that the alt-right is in total disarray. Now, by pointing out that the alt-right is presently very weak, I'm not suggesting that its opponents should become complacent. As we've seen, even a marginalized and weakened extreme right can be incredibly dangerous. In fact, as the alt-right continues to decline and its chances of seeing a real-world breakthrough effectively disappear, I actually think its likelihood of spawning more violent groups could actually increase. I can very easily imagine a situation where groups analogous to the Order from the 1980s start appearing on the scene. Extreme right lone wolf attacks are also a significant threat and very difficult to predict and prevent. But when thinking about the alt-right, it is important to put it into context. It is a small movement, and as its tactics become better known and its opponents become better organized, its ability to project size and strength continues to weaken. Rather than becoming a permanent fixture of American political life, the alt-right may end up being remembered as just one more oddity of the Trump era, ultimately signifying relatively little. Even if the alt-right disappears entirely, however, it is still worth studying because the radical right is always going to exist, probably, with or without the alt-right label. And so its next iteration, whoever leads that charge, will undoubtedly study this current period and try to just note its strengths and weaknesses and hope to do better next time. But thinking even more broadly than that, it's important to note that the alt-right's decline is not necessarily an indication that race relations more broadly are getting better. The fact that unapologetic open white nationalism doesn't presently appear to be a major threat to liberal democracy doesn't mean that our democracy is in a good place. Even without the alt-right, we're a long way off from an equitable and harmonious society. And unfortunately, I think that fixing those problems is an even greater challenge than trying to combat the online alt-right. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much. This was an excellent presentation. Let me, Rick, you can have the first question.
Thanks, George. That was really interesting. Another tributary of alt-right you don't mention is the men's rights movement, hip-hop artist culture. And while I think it's quite credible to argue that white nationalism has become toxic to the self-described alt-right, this was always a radically misogynist patriarchal movement. So in a figure like Milo Yiannopoulos, obviously he couldn't be credibly called a white nationalist leader. He just married a black man. Mm-hmm. But as an anti-feminist spokesman, he was without parallel. Vader, controller. So maybe the hard distinction between alt-right and AltLight becomes a little less tenable in that optic. And also maybe the resilience or mutation of the movement is something you can consider in light of something like the sociologist Tressie Cottom just had a very, very harrowing article. I think it was in either the Chronicle Review or Inside Higher Education about the systematic harassment of feminist professors, really becoming epidemic and quite harrowing. So what do you think about misogyny as an organizing principle of the alt-right and alt-light?
I agree with that. And I do think that the misogynistic element of the alt-right has always been there, though I actually think that it is not as consistent on the issue of gender as it has been on the issue of race. I mean, I would say that the entirety of the alt-right is anti-feminist. And in fact, I'd say that some of the alt-right is even worse than the men's rights movement. For example, the white Sharia meme that took off last year. But as an organizing principle, I think that the men's rights movement is still separate from the alt-right in that there are people in the so-called manosphere who say they want to focus just on the gender issue, but not so much on the race issue. But I think your point also speaks to the fact that misogyny is, at least by conservatives, viewed as being qualitatively different from racism, that you can be anti-feminist and you can be anti-woman and you can be misogynistic without the same type of sanctioning that you would get from being an open racist. So I think that speaks to a little bit of what's going on within mainstream conservatism as well.
Hi, yes, there was a good talk. I am interested in particular, the ways in which this does intersect with state power to one degree or another, particularly what we've seen in the past several years of the systematic sort of disarming of the police or repressive apparatus from surveilling these kinds of groups. The state of Tennessee just recently removed alt-right groups from terrorist watch lists and things like this, and that this became a kind of ball to bounce back and forth in the Obama era of like, are white nationalist terrorists, do the FBI surveil them or not? That sense has been dismantled to one degree or another, leading to, I think, an escalated concern of, as you say, a return to kind of lone wolf terrorism and the like. Far more terrorism occurs in this country from right-wing white supremacists and others than from Muslims or Islamic extremists and what have you. And that seems to be very much a part of the ways in which the alt-right intersects with the state and its policing power. I'm just wondering what you think about that or what you say about that.
Well, I think that the state has generally done a competent job of infiltrating the extreme right as it exists in the real world. I mean, it's become sort of a joke in the extreme right that the KKK cannot gather without there being at least a couple of FBI informants at their meetings. The alt-right, though, I think is not...
the FBI on, though. I mean, not to interrupt, but like in the 1950s and 1960s, we know the FBI thoroughly infiltrated the Klan because they were the Klan.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but the Klan today, I think that we're in a different social scenario. Perhaps I'm mistaken about that. You may have more expertise as to what's sort of the ins and outs of these different government institutions. But I think part of the problem is not even so much that the government is not putting resources into this, is that it's not entirely clear how you monitor something as amorphous as these online groups. And as they try to transition into the real world, I think that those old playbooks that did seem to work to some degree or another can be revived. But as it was mostly kind of a group of just anonymous racists on the internet, what do you do with that as the government? I don't think people have really figured out what the proper way for the state to sort of attack the problem was. And I don't think anyone knows the answer to that question yet. Does that answer your question at all? I guess
it does, but I mean, there's a group like the Adam group that's in California. Mm-hmm. We've recently learned that like multiple package bombs murdered African Americans in Austin, Texas. These are things that should compel the state to extensive, exhaustive terrorist investigations. Were these people of color committing these crimes? Were they Muslims committing these crimes? But because they're white people attacking people of color, the state is effectively silent. The police power does not approach these problems.
And I've actually been quite shocked by the lack of attention that Adam Waffen has gotten. I mean, here we have literally a satanic death cult. These people genuinely call themselves Satanists. They basically worship Charles Manson, and they have been tied to 5 murders over the past couple of years. Yet it has been general silence about it, and I don't understand why, because it's certainly not the case that these alt-right groups aren't getting attention. How come, Matt Heimbach and his goons get headlines, but Adam Waffen is ignored? I don't know why. That's something that I hope changes.
Yeah, you made a very nice point that during the election campaign of Trump, the alt-right had a kind of focal point and could kind of energize behind that campaign. And I'm just wondering, you paint this picture of a decline now, but I'm thinking of midterms and possibly even the next presidential election, and where would you see the kind of alt-right falling in that case? Or, isn't it possible that they could once again generate a lot of support, especially given the fact that Trump, is rather vague in terms of his Republican and even more right identity? Don't you think if he gives off that vibe, so to speak, that a lot of that energy could once again be mobilized behind him by the people that you're talking about?
Potentially, yes. At present, I don't see any far-right enthusiasm for the upcoming midterms. As mentioned, sort of the Bannon's goal of sort of creating a new sort of nationalist Tea Party, it doesn't look like it's coming together. So there's not really a slate of candidates that is energizing the alt-right, except for Paul Nehlen, who has no chance. So I think the 2016 presidential election will prove to be unique. Perhaps 2020 things will turn around, but I think part of that will also depend on whether or not Trump manages to successfully re-energize the alt-right. Because, from the outside perspective, Trump seems like a very radical and disruptive president, but from what the alt-right was wanted and what many of them expected, they view him as a major disappointment. They were appalled, for example, by his attack on Syria at the start of his presidency, arguing that indicated that he was going to become sort of a conventional neoconservative. They're bothered that the wall has not started. They're bothered that there's not been any real movement on immigration, and that he's willing to at least talk about allowing the Dreamers to stay. Without anything real and substantive, I think they're going to have a hard time building the same sort of excitement. I mean, the one sort of alt-right victory that they've seen was the travel ban from those majority Muslim countries. But as politically foolish as that might have been, it's sort of inconsequential in terms of sort of the big picture that these radical movements are trying to aspire to.
Let me just ask you, speaking of elections, you suggested during your talk that in your view the mobilization of the alt-right, the extraordinary mobilization of the alt-right during the 2016 election was relatively insignificant for the election. When you said that, I thought about Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which Trump won by a collective total of 88,000 votes. So I wonder if, with some historical distance, it might be viewed that they were the significant weight that gave Trump the election. And because, as you say, previously, these were people who did not participate in electoral politics.
Yeah, and that's sort of an open question, because you may absolutely be right. I'm just not convinced that the alt-right, I suspect that it did bring people into the electoral system that maybe weren't interested in it before, but it might have also alienated people who might have supported Trump otherwise. That's why I'm still not sure if it was a mistake or not when Hillary Clinton gave her speech in Reno in August of 2016, in which she denounced the alt-right and tried to tie Trump to the alt-right. Obviously, it was not successful in the sense that it didn't stop Trump from winning, but her goal there, in my mind, was to try to make Trump toxic to conservative, suburban voters who didn't really want to be associated with something as extreme and unpleasant as the alt-right. And it's possible that a lot of people did turn away from Trump for that reason. So in the absence of the alt-right, his victory very well might have been bigger than it was. But I don't know about that. That's just an intuition.
Christine?
Thanks. Wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about the ways in which you study the alt-right and the kinds of methods that you use to study the alt-right and the kinds of data that you rely on to make some of the claims that you've made today in terms of the strength or lack of strength of the alt-right. Can you say just a little bit about the methodology?
Well, sure. There's a lot of what I did for my recent book was based on interviews with the relevant people. In terms of getting hard data, there's very little out there. I've been talking with Thomas Main of Baruch College. He's done a little bit of work on that, and he's been sort of my go-to guy trying to explain why the alt-right isn't actually all that large. But a lot of what I did was interviews, and often these interviews had to be done totally anonymously by people who have alt-right accounts on Twitter and these various places. And the bigger problem was figuring out which content to include or not, because there were a lot of people trying to feed me bogus information. So it was a question of trying to always be able to verify that something was true or not. The quantitative side, to the extent that there was one, was also, I used the software R they have a package that you can use to analyze Twitter with, so you can download all of the tweets that come in with particular hashtags and that sort of thing. So I used that to sort of see how different things were trending over time.
Yeah,
excuse me, I had my hand up at the beginning, and all these people right from the beginning, I had my hand up and you haven't called.
Congratulations. Thank you. We're going to go on.
But he just raised his hand for the first time.
No.
Come on, you've been calling on people you're
I had my hands up for the whole time.
Wait a second.
You didn't want to call on me before you did.
Please.
Why don't you shut up? Why hypocrite over there?
I don't care who goes first.
Please.
Okay.
And please just keep that to yourself. Thank you.
Yeah. A couple things. I mean, I do appreciate the information you present, but I feel that there's a whole bunch of broader aspects that are missing. And one of them is basically the whole history of the United States as a white European settler state, and basically white nationalism is the basis of the United States, and it's only been like for various sometimes opportunistic reasons, and also because of certain struggles by oppressed groups, that there's been a certain amount of departure from whiteness as the central identity of the United States, colonialism, imperialism, and all that. And another thing, I think you didn't really talk at all about the class forces involved, both the rich people who support or don't support these various factions, like the Mercers. I believe that the Mercers support what you call the alt-right, but maybe I'm wrong about that. And of course, there's the Koch brothers, who's maybe support slightly different factions. I think those are all very important. And also, the relation, how other groups are sometimes brought into the U.S. imperialist nationalist project when they're needed. Well, black people, of course, Jews, particularly Zionist Jews, their complicated relationship with white nationalism. I just like to see these other aspects were tied in with your analysis.
Well, I talk about this actually quite a bit in the book, where I note that, in fact, the United States of America has operated as a sort of a de facto white supremacist state probably for a majority of its history. And that to some degree conservatives especially are being a bit disingenuous when they go back and sort of try to sort of imagine an imagined colorblind initial history of the United States, where Jefferson and those others were totally sincere in their egalitarianism. So I think that's an appropriate point. I didn't get into it today, just as a matter of time, because obviously when we talk about the overall history of the United States, there's so much more that we could go into than could be done over the course of just an hour.
Thank you for taking my question. I just want to say, first of all, I think most of us should know that just because someone has a black partner or marries someone black, that doesn't mean that they're not white supremacists or white racists, because essentially there's a certain number of black people who could be essentially effectively classified as white supremacists too. Clarence Thomas comes to mind. While I certainly don't want to generalize and wouldn't generalize about all white gay people, there's a certain white sexual fetish that's popular among certain gay people too. So I just wanted to mention that. The other thing is that I don't expect you to comment on here, but I've noticed at this university that there are a certain number of South Asian males, seemingly exclusively, that seem to support these white nationalist speakers. This was sort of, for those who paid attention to it, even in the Daily Californian, there was a South Asian male opinions columnist named Rudra Reddy. And he was sort of trolling in his Daily Cal, of all places at Berkeley, his Daily Cal column. And in his last column, he said he didn't care whether he convinced anyone to his view or not, or whether he alienated the entire campus with his view. And he supported, bringing in Milo and David Horowitz and all these kinds of white racists, notorious white racists. So I think for those who might be interested in that, that's something to pay attention to. There was a South Asian woman who wrote a column criticizing.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I'll just wrap up with this. Criticizing that by saying brown people are racist too, she meant South Asian males. My question is, just out of humorous curiosity, where do these alt-right people plan to put their ethnic supremacist state or ethnically pure state? And the other thing is, excuse if this is a naive question, but in my naive question, how can you say that, I don't mean it to sound so arrogant, but how is it that Trump would not at least once have been considered part of the alt-right, given that Bannon was a principal in his campaign and also in his White House?
Well, to the first question, the alt-right itself, in terms of what its long-term vision looks like, is pretty cagey about it. People like Richard Spencer will say, well, they want ethnic cleansing, but they want it peaceful, but they don't want to say where this new ethno-state is going to be. If we look back at older white nationalist literature, all these different, extremist theorists had different ideas. Richard Butler said, well, it should be the Pacific Northwest, or Tom Metzger said, no, it should be the entire Pacific coast. And of course, we have the neo-Confederates who say, let's bring back the Confederacy. And then, of course, you have the true extremists like William Pierce, who in the Turner Diary says, no, it has to be the entire globe. It has to be the whole thing. So right now, the alt-right, rather than sort of getting into these debates, what they seem to be mostly interested in is just trying to even plant the idea of getting people to think like, well, maybe that's something that they could want to do in the future. And then, once they've won that particular meme victory, then maybe the details can be worked out later. That seems to be the general strategy right now. Could you remind me again what the second question was? This is where sort of the definition of alt-right gets a little bit confusing. One thing that helped me with my understanding was Joshua Green's book, Devil's Bargain, which talked about Bannon and the alt-right, and it helped me understand what Bannon meant when he called Breitbart a platform for the alt-right. And he was talking about that window in really the summer of 2016 when alt-right sort of exploded as like a catch-all for Trump's overall populist movement. And of course, during that window, I think that if people were calling Trump alt-right, they wouldn't necessarily be wrong. I think they would be wrong today, though. I mean, because Trump is, has some radical views in his own way. I think there is a qualitative difference between what he's pushing now and what, say, the ideologues of the alt-right want, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, thank you.
This is, thank you firstly for an excellent presentation, particularly on looking at the origins of the actual term alt-right. I mean, I find it very interesting because outside of the US, the term alternative right or alt-right is seen by a lot of conservative parties or sort of populist right parties and movements, particularly in Europe, as something that appeals far more. The alternative right seems far more appealing than far right or even radical right, which is often used. And I'm just sort of interested more in, I suppose, semantics. And something which I was sort of touching upon earlier is just how far Trump has actually really coordinated a lot of this and co-opted a lot of this potential far-right strategy or potential alternative right electives, and if you like, managed to use this for his own effect to almost splinter them and see them off. That's really good.
Yeah, that's the big question, right? Is Trump a sort of a Machiavellian genius in his own way, or is he a buffoon who keeps getting lucky? I don't know. I mean, to what extent does he even understand? I mean, what the alt-right was about? I'm quite convinced that Bannon understood it, or at least came to understand it. Did Trump? I'm just not sure to the degree to which he thought that element of his support was important. The fact it is a bit telling, though, that he waited so long to denounce it, and I don't know. And we can speculate as to what the reason was, but I think that's an important point to remember as well.
I'm at the journalism school. I've been doing my thesis on the alt-right, and I think your analysis is really excellent, but one point I kind of disagree with is that you kind of said that as the alt-right's kind of dying down in disarray, we'll probably see more lone wolf attacks, terrorist groups, that's the form it'll take. I don't think that's the only form it'll take, and I don't think that's the only form that it's taking right now. Like, there's still media networks like the Red Elephants who have like thousands of people, on Facebook sharing their videos and whatnot, and pushing like those awful conspiracies about like the Parkland shooter being like, and all of his, the crisis actors, that kind of thing. And then there's also people who interacted during the like kind of the bloom of the alt-right back in 16, 17 that have been incorporated into the mainstream of the Republican Party. And I think one of the big things that the alt-right talked about and still talks about a lot is the Overton window, this idea, and you're familiar with it, the idea that part of the goal is to push what's acceptable further to the right I think that's kind of one of the big legacies we have to keep paying attention to. So.
No, you're absolutely right, and this is part of sort of the fracturing that's going on within the alt-right, because there is an element to it that basically wants to totally cut off the sort of the neo-Nazi elements, sort of the Matt Heimbach elements, the radical elements, and instead really go back to sort of classic, American flag type of a style. And it's possible that that is an element that will be more successful, that it'll be sort of a group that still has kind of alt-right underlying sensibilities.
Those elements push stuff like this idea of white genocide,
stuff
Yes.
like that.
Yeah, and the question is how much is that going to expand? Because I do think that is an element of the alt-right that's going to survive, and I think it probably will just try to drop the alt-right label and sort of create sort of a new kind of American nationalist movement. And that is something that will need to be observed as well, and sort of try to make sense of that, because that is a movement that I think has a lot better chance of kind of, existing within sort of a bigger conservative framework, and go back to the as it was in 2016 and 2017, where there were these points of connection between these various ideologues. So I think you're right.
Okay. The truth is we're kind of out of time, so I'd like people to join me in thanking George Hawley for the presentation.